just a little bit of my background before I got to Vietnam. Actually, I was in the Marine Corps 15 years before I went to Vietnam. And I was a platoon commander in the 2nd Division at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, 1st Marine Division in Korea, 3rd Marine Division in Japan then, and now it's in Okinawa. I was an instructor at Quantico, Virginia in the Marine Corps school system. I was a Naval ROTC instructor at the University of Mississippi. And then, let's see, and I had a tour of sea duty aboard the USS Des Moines when it was a 6th Fleet flagship. And that's when I met my wife while I was out there. That was very much a hardship tour because the USS Des Moines was, while I was aboard the 2 years, was home ported in the French Riviera. And you can't beat that for a duty station. And the Marine Corps counted that as a hardship tour. I never did tell them otherwise. The only thing, and so I ended up going to Vietnam in 1968. At that time, as I mentioned, I'd been in the Marine Corps 15 years. I was a major, a pretty senior major at that time. And so when I arrived there, I was assigned to the 3rd Marine Regiment of the 3rd Marine Division. Now, I'll use, so that there was reason to bring the map in, we were located right in the demilitarized zone area. The northernmost I-Corps area, northern part of Quang Tri Province. I don't know how much you've gotten into the geography of Vietnam. And when I first arrived there, I was a logistics officer, or S4 as they called it, in the 3rd Marines. And there you have, well, I used to say you have responsibility for all the jobs that no one else wants, but really it involved transportation, it involved evacuation, supply, maintenance, and those sort of things that keep an organization going. It was a very important job to me because it provided me an opportunity to see the whole regiment as it operated as part of the 3rd Marine Division and to see what it took to keep it going. And I was very fortunate a couple of months later to be selected and promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and I was assigned then as the executive officer for the 3rd Marine Regiment, which meant I was really the number 2 guy in the regiment. The regiment's about 3,500 Marines, and it's strictly an infantry organization. And from there, after 2 months, I went to the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines as a battalion commander, and was in that job for 8 months. And that was, of course, a highlight of my career. I had others, but certainly in command of an infantry battalion in combat is a goal that Marines really do seek. To give you an idea of what you have in an infantry battalion, I'll keep it as brief as possible. There are about 1,000 Marines in it. You have all sorts of infantry weapons from caliber .45 pistols, really, the service rifle, which is the M16 rifle, the mortars, 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter, 30 caliber machine guns, and 50 caliber machine guns. I think that probably runs the range. And most of our movement at that time, any movement we made was by helicopter, or I used to call it ankle bone express, by foot. We were in locations where you couldn't use vehicles except one. And that was when it was pacification role, and I'll probably mention something about the pacification role in my 20 minutes, so it doesn't expire before then. But that was generally my background going there. And what I enjoyed about it was being with the people. An infantry battalion commander, by the way, does not stay in a fixed position, particularly in that type of war, where you're in jungle environment. You stay with your people, and because you know what's going on, you're able to react, you're able to request when necessary, and the principal job is to seek out, locate, fix, and defeat the enemy. And so that's basically what my assignment was, and probably for many of my comments here will impact on my time as an infantry battalion commander. One thing I'd like to, beyond my background, talk about are the things that, some comments from my time. As we know that we didn't win the war. We won the battles, but we didn't win the war. People used to say, well, how can you do that? Well, it's because we have to look at the first principle of war, which is the objective. We were in Vietnam never given a clear objective of what was to be accomplished other than to a free and independent Republic of Vietnam. But how do you get there? Well, for example, when I say specific objectives, World War II, what was the objective? It was unconditional surrender. What was it in Desert Storm? It was to clear the, now of course that was total war. You have limited objectives, or limited wars, and you have a limited objective of clearing the Iraqis out of Kuwait. You get it done and it's mission accomplished. We probably, in the Korean War, the problem was we had an objective, and that was to secure the Republic of Korea back to the 38th parallel, but we didn't stop there. We extended the objective, and we brought the Chinese into the war, and that caused the war to go on for 3 more years. So you really have to stay fixed on the objective. And in Vietnam, the objectives were very vague. There was really, it developed into a no-win strategy. And if you can't win, what are you doing there? Winning meaning achieving an objective of a safe and free. And what were some of the things that impact on it? Well, as Royce will probably tell you, rules of engagement is going to be one thing. And the rules of engagement mean how do you, in an infantry organization, for instance, seek out, fix, and destroy an enemy. The ground side, not the aviation side, the ground side could not go across the demilitarized zone, which is about halfway down the 17th parallel. And we could not go beyond that. The enemy could come through. In fact, most of the time we could not get through the demilitarized zone, even enter the demilitarized zone. So what do they do? You see the arrows going through Laos over, if you can, from where you are to the, well, it'd be to your left side of the Republic of Vietnam from up north. Those arrows you see is what is known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So if you can't go into Laos, all he has to do is use the sanctuary of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Oh, you could interdict it by air, and it was interdicted by B-52s, it was interdicted by attack planes and so forth. But as our commanding general said one time, I'm fighting a war with my hands, one hand tied behind my back. And a lot of times it was with 2 hands tied behind your back. We ran into such things as ceasefire periods at Christmas. Well, ceasefire gave the enemy an opportunity to maneuver around. A bombing pause. Bombing pause gave them a chance to move missiles around up north. So when you throw in these rules of engagement that inhibit your movement, and it doesn't inhibit the enemy, it's like a boxer who can, one guy has to stay in the ring, the other one can get out of the ring, you can't go after him, he can go in and punch and then jump out of the ring. I use that to symbolize the frustration, and it causes a lot of frustration of people when they know that they're coming through the demilitarized zone. They're at the 17th parallel, and we can't go into the demilitarized zone. That was one of the rules of engagement, are probably one of the big dissatisfactions that a lot of people had that came out of there, because they could do things that we couldn't do. There was another thing that was bad. We had what was called a body count. Now, why did we have a body count? Because someone with green eye shades and probably a calculator, they weren't very sophisticated in those days, came up with the idea that if you killed 250,000 North Korean soldiers and Viet Cong in 1 year, you could win the war. And that was what was behind the body count. And there was more attention paid to body count than there was how effectively defeated or how effective was the enemy by his organization. We didn't look at organization, we looked at individuals. And that was, there was a lot of anger over that one too, that people were worried about body count and not the impact it was having on the enemy. Another item that particularly in the early part of the war was the activation of reserves. We did not activate the reserves. There are probably a couple of reasons for that. there's a War Powers Act where if you activate reserves, you got to go back to the Congress if you want to keep them for past 60 days. Well, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, I'm sure that the president didn't want to send anyone over to the Congress and try and get that extended. There was enough anger over that. And so what we missed out on were some trained personnel that could have come into the pipeline early in the war when we expanded, because we expanded probably from 2 million to, God, I forget how many we had at the end of the war. I know we had 510,000 over in Vietnam at the 1968 when I was there. But we failed to use a prepared, ready force to go in and support the units that went in there first. We had to grow our own. It's kind of like the guy that has, in an operating table, has an major artery cut, he bleeds. They put in a stoppage, then they can't put blood transfusion because it'll blow the stoppage out, and he has to make his own blood. Well, he's totally ineffective for a time. I had a boss that this happened to. That's why I use that analogy. But we were not we could not. We just had to grow from within to get up to this enormous force it took to support the war in Vietnam. We fought a war of attrition against a very determined enemy on his homeland. That presents some problems too. Well, that ties in with your rule of engagement of a body count of having to do 250,000. I'm going to speak to it later, and that is that there was a disagreement between the General Westmoreland and the Marine, and that is that Westmoreland's object was a search and destroy. Of course, he was in charge over there, so that's what it was. And the Marines program, or desires, was a pacification program where you work with the people and provide them secure areas where they develop leadership. And I'll probably talk a little bit about that later on. But those were just some of the things that, let me see if I listed any more of my anger here. Oh, ineffective bombing campaign. I'm sure Royce could speak to that. But we had a situation where one commander took care of the bombing campaign in the Republic of Vietnam. When I say Republic of Vietnam, that's South Vietnam, and just a little over the DMZ, and his boss, Commander-in-Chief Pacific in Hawaii, was responsible for the bombing that took place in the north. That wasn't necessarily true for Admiral Sharp, who had that job, and then later Admiral McCain, John McCain's father, because really the targets during the Johnson administration were picked in the White House either Tuesday or Thursday during a luncheon. Half the time there wasn't a military person there. So here we had a political picking of targets for military people to go out and bomb in North Vietnam. That was another great limitation. So yes, that wasn't a victory parade we saw getting on helicopters on the 30th of April 1975. But people said, how could we win the battles and lose the war? Well, we never found the right objective. And we looked at probably more the military side of it and not as much on the political side. And the political side, this ties in with the pacification program versus the search and destroy. Now, who do we blame for this? Do we blame Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon? Who? You could start with Franklin D. Roosevelt, because he wanted an independent Indochina. That was his position during World War II. What happened? Well, he went to the Yalta Conference. He was a sick man. He was a very tired man. He died, as you know, shortly thereafter. And he gave in to the British, principally, and also the French, to recolonize some of these locations, such as Indochina. You can go to the next one. Harry Truman. At Potsdam, they reconfirmed the fact that the French could go back into Vietnam. He was really concerned, and rightfully, he was concerned more, and I can understand it because the dominoes were falling in Central Europe. with what was going on in the defense of Western Europe than he was with what was going on in the Southeast Asia. That's essentially it. So naturally that played a part in it also. From Truman you go to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was there when Dien Bien Phu fell. Made a very courageous decision not to support the French at Dien Bien Phu, even though he was advised against it. But wisely, he took the advice of Matthew Ridgway, who's one of the finest soldiers ever to serve in the United States Army. Then came John Kennedy, but about the time he came in, the National, I call it NLF, National Liberation Front, was activated and created about a month before he came into office. So he faced that, and he started expanding the advisory role, and he was getting all kinds of conflicting reports. He'd send one guy over to see what was going on in the Republic of Vietnam, and he'd come back with one report, and then another guy'd come back with another. One time he sent two of them over, and they both, and the question was, did you go to the same country? And so it finally ended with, sadly, just before his assassination, of a coup taking place in the Republic of Vietnam, which really brought the Americans running the country. Sadly, he let the coup go, and it took the life as Jim and his brother knew. Then, of course, we know Johnson. Johnson sneaked us into the war to the tune of 510,000. Nixon had a plan. We never knew what the secret plan was he had. However, at least he did something when he was in there. He could have cut and run. He didn't. In fact, he brought the thing to an end. Ford was there when it was all over in April 1975. I was going to talk to you about what happened during World War II, very briefly. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh, when he came in 1943, after the Japanese moved in, when the French were defeated by the Nazis in 1940, and the Japanese moved right into Vietnam. I had about 30,000 operating there, but Ho Chi Minh came in and supported the Allies and the Americans and saved many of our flyers. And there was tacit indication on his part that the United States, because Roosevelt supported, the United States would support an independent Vietnam. Post-World War II, we had I think the big thing that came out of post-World War II was the approach of a monolithic communism. In other words, everything run by the Soviet Union. They called the shots, and they were not only going to have the dominoes fall in Europe, it's going to fall over in Asia. What took place to give this opinion? Well, the Berlin blockade, where they blocked Berlin for a period of about 10 months. Following that, China fell in 1949 to the communists. Right after that, the Russians detonated an atomic bomb in 1949, and then in 1950 the communists invaded Korea. So those four things, everybody concluded at that time, these guys are really bad, and anything that has to do with any communist movements are orchestrated in Moscow, and we're against them, because otherwise we're going to lose, because we've already lost Central Europe. The fall of Dien Bien Phu, you probably studied that. Yeah, Eisenhower did not come to the aid. The Geneva Conference, which divided Vietnams between the North and the South. Refugees had free movement, North and South. They can take their pick for a certain period of time. And a key when there'd be elections in 1956. And as we know, about that time, in came Jim, because he was to form a government. Then he declared himself president in 1955 or 54, kicked the French out, and had a repressive leadership. And he was Catholic. 10% of the country Catholic. He was very repressive against the Buddhists, and that was part of his problem. Then let's see. I guess I guess I better stop right there.
40 years ago, Vietnam did change our lives. At least it came into our lives. We lost a lot of friends because Jim was a captain in the beginning in 1965, 66, and then eventually became a major, and that's when he went over as a major. But so that many of my neighbors, we were living at Quantico when it started, and he was in a school called junior school, which was just a junior type school for captains and majors. And we all got orders, meaning a lot of us in the school got orders to go to Hawaii. And we were all so excited. Well, by the time we were going to move on those orders, they had been changed and stopped to Camp Pendleton. Jim was selected for a 6-week school, the nuclear warfare school, and all the rest of the guys that we knew and whatnot that were going to Hawaii were not. So they ended up in California calling him desperately saying, you better hurry, it's, you know, we're leaving. Well, he ended up getting there late, and he didn't go there. And so 1 year later, we got orders to the University of Mississippi, like he said. And he wrote a letter saying he was going to be the only major in the whole Marine Corps that wasn't going to get to war. But of course, as we know with war, it goes on and on and on. So we spent 2 years in Mississippi, and he got his orders to go to Vietnam. Now, in those days, a wife could not stay in quarters. If I happened to be in quarters, we were not allowed to stay in quarters. We had to move off a base and make room for people who were there with their husbands. We all, or most of us, felt that we would much rather live off base when our husbands were home and on base when we needed them when our husbands were gone and at war. But that was not the case, and that was not changed until 1976. Now the families can live on base, which is a very important thing. So I didn't know where I was going to go, and my parents said, we'll put an addition on our house, and you bring the boys home. And that's exactly what I did. I moved to a town where I grew up. It's a small town outside of New York City. It's a fairly wealthy town, and because they didn't call the reserves up, I didn't know anybody else in town that had a son, a husband, anybody that was in Vietnam. But it just so happened that out of the 1,000 men, my husband had a young man who came from Rye. Now, Rye is the home of Barbara Bush, so you get an idea. Anyway, the mother, at that time, there was no Privacy Act, she went down to the post office and she said, who's getting mail from Rye? And so they gave her my name, and she called me up. And we had a wonderful relationship for many, many years to come. In fact, it was kind of interesting. When I watched the old movies, I think that's the way they lived. This family was quite wealthy, and so when they would sit down to dinner, everybody wore the coat and tie, and we had the maid and the cook and all the rest of that. So it was my time out. Instead of taking care of my little kids, I could go out and have a good time with somebody, another family. But her son was injured, and he lost his right arm, the use of his right arm, and he never really recovered. We went to his wedding. I know I still keep up with his wife, but she ended up having to divorce him because he ended up sleeping with a gun under his pillow. So a lot of the things that we hear about from all of the young men who come home that have problems, we lived through that with this young man who was very talented and had had a wonderful life and just couldn't cope with it. I ended up moving back with 3 boys to my parents' house. They were 2½, 5, and 7. And I never had a cross word. We never had a cross word in the house with my parents. And to tell you how wonderful it was, my mother had a friend who said, don't you dread them coming home? And my mother said, no, she didn't. And my friends would say, don't you dread going home? But I cut the boys' hair, and my mother would wash their hair, and I would cut their hair, and my father would sweep up the hair. I mean, that's the way the whole year worked. And my father would come home from work. We only had 1 television at the time, and he'd come home from work and he'd want to watch TV and watch the news and whatnot. And of course the kids wanted to watch I Love Lucy and, you know, F Troop and all those things. And so they would sort of be not too happy. And Dad watched it for about 3 days, and he said, you know, the boys are right. We'll watch I Love Lucy and F Troop. And so that's what he watched the rest of the year while we were there. So we were extremely, extremely lucky. And right now, when I tell you that, you know, that we have three sons that went into the military, all on NROTC scholarships, and one that is still in the military full time. There's one other thing that Linda always brings up, that if you've watched some of the old movies and talking about, the one about Private Ryan too, the mother answering the door always looked out the window. I can tell you that is true, because I never answered a door when I was in Rye without looking out the window first to prepare myself, just in case something had happened. And the other thing that I did, right or wrong, I had a picture of Jim, but the boys and I rarely ever talked about him. Now that sounds funny. Some people, they just, you know, that was their whole life with their father, but I wanted to prepare those boys that if he didn't come home, that we could certainly survive, and survive well without him. Whether we would have or not, who knows, but at least we wanted to make believe that we could survive without him. So those are the two things. And the military, it's so nice to see today that the people are really supporting the troops. And that is a very important thing. Even though the government, and you don't like Bush or you like Bush, and the people are fighting all the rest, but just continue to support the troops. And Jim always laughs at me, because if I go to church and they don't talk about the troops, I don't give them any money. I mean, I've gone all over the country, and I'll go to a thing and I'll say, Father, you don't deserve any money, you didn't remember the troops. And I really feel very strongly about that. But not that they care whether I give them any money or not, but that's my personal stand. So, but anyway, we had a very fine life, and we've been very lucky.